So did everybody have some coffee today? Yeah? Good. Okay, I just want to share with you that the coffee is kind of like a pride and joy thing to me. Today we serve Nicaraguan and Peruvian in the decaf. And the I don't need it. That's why I put it down. So the Nicaraguan, the projects we have in Nicaragua, and we've worked with the same folks for over 20 years. In Nicaragua, we've had landmine programs for coffee farmers, taking coffee farmers who are victims of landmines and giving them prosthetics, therapy, and job training in a cafe that all the proceeds went back to support the clinic. It was a very successful program for about 8 years. And we also have neonatal trainings going on right now, which are very needed. In Peru, we have reforestation, women's loans, and local coffee roasting for sale, not dependent on the export market. So I'm telling you this because I live and breathe social enterprise. My first experience overseas was in 1976, turning cow manure into methane gas in India, in Uttar Pradesh, India, and I've just haven't come down since. So this stuff is very important to me. I've learned a lot of lessons along the way. I managed to pick up a degree here at Yale in law and some other cool things along the way, but my heart and soul is in the villages, and my background is as a social justice and indigenous rights lawyer throughout the 70s and 80s. So I come to social enterprise not as a business person, but from a wider lens, and my analysis and my approach is very, very different. But it's also been very, very successful. So what I'm here to share with you today is not so much the nuts and bolts and techniques and feel-good stories about the projects we've had, but some deeper stuff. So since I'm not going to be here after this talk, I encourage anybody who wants to follow up on anything we're talking about to email me at dean@deansbeans.com. Very simple, right? I'm now in my 60s. I need simple mnemonic devices. Dean@deansbeans. That's easy. So, as I started to say, I didn't come here today to offer you equations, techniques, or great examples of things that may or may not work in your particular situation, but I did come here to challenge us. To challenge us to open up our personal paradigms at how we look at the world and take a good look at ourselves. I think it's the key to success in international development. Now look, let me be honest. Don't all of us, you can close your eyes to answer this, you don't have to raise your hand, but don't all of us deep down inside kind of think we're pretty cool? Don't we actually have a little bit of the savior complex? Of course we do. And it's okay, but we can't take it too far. We have skills, we have something to offer these folks in different parts of the world, these victims of poverty and underdevelopment. We're really great people doing selfless, wonderful work, and that's true. But we need to change that paradigm, to stop seeing people as victims and see them as partners driving us and driving our projects. We are facilitators, we are resources, and we are networks. But ultimately, this isn't about us. If we can make that shift, everything else changes. In the past decade, over $1 trillion has been invested in non-military development and social enterprise aid, and there's really very little to show for it. Present company excluded, of course. If we can make that shift, that paradigmatic shift in understanding, maybe that sad statistic about the $1 trillion can change going forward. Creating and maintaining serious social enterprise is hard work. It is a real uphill struggle against the long odds of custom, culture, politics, entrenched systems of regulation and control that stack the odds against success, especially in the international arena. Many of these underlying causes of enterprise failure are actually out of our control. Chronic underdevelopment in the source villages, lack of basic reading and math skills, no computer skills, no ATMs, can you imagine? No or erratic electricity, poor roads, poor infrastructure, war, long-term conflict, societal, familial, or self-oppression of women or minority populations, especially indigenous populations, cultural systems of control or hierarchical or gender-dominated decision-making. Wow, that's what we're up against. Out of any or a combination of these dynamics come behaviors with the people we're working with, such as not showing up, not revealing problems, not wanting to disappoint, that lead to poor performance or outright enterprise failure. The best intention and education we have in the world it's still a struggle to overcome all of that, because it's a lot. It's not easy. But it's not always what happens there. Many of the reasons projects don't take off or don't last very long, they're our own. We're all creatures of culture, even though we don't see our own culture. Everybody else has a culture, but we don't for some reason. It's like everybody has an accent, but we don't. You know that one. So we're trapped in the ideologies of our time, even ideologies in our class. We are creatures of our religious, social, and familial cultures. And in the case of anyone seeking to do business as a vehicle for social change, as I have for well over 20 years, we are creatures of the business culture. And we need to be aware of how we've internalized much of this cultural imperative, especially business cultures, and know how to confront them in our own work, because they do get in the way. So, what are they? One major dynamic for social enterprises and NGOs is the problem of being too investor or donor driven, because that's where the money is, just like robbing a bank. Okay, that's where the money is. Many organizations feel the need to satisfy donors or investors on a quarterly or very regular basis with new news, great new developments, even when there's nothing happening. This can lead to overpromising and too often to misrepresentation. Think 3 cups of tea. Or, well, I'll save that. I won't say that. 3 cups of tea. We'll leave it at that one. It can also lead to generating too many new projects too quickly without seeing the maturation and development of what we're doing now. That's the concept of digging too many shallow wells instead of digging a deep one. This is a real issue for large NGOs, particularly, such as CARE, Plan International. In the old days, this is starting to change a little bit. Not really, I just experienced it with Mercy Corps in the Spice Islands this year. Projects are funded and based on sort of like a 3-year cycle. And at the end of the 3-year cycle, what happens? Generally, the projects close. If they're good projects, they get turned over to local folks, and you say, well, you know, go try to find some other funding. And then the bingo moves on. And I remember in the early days of being involved in this stuff, I would ask CARE, Foster Parents Plan, now Plan International, so what happens after you leave that village in Guatemala? What happens like 3 years later? And they would say, we don't know. Why don't you know? Well, we don't have a budget to go back and check. Then how do you know if your project is sustainable? Well, back in those days, nobody even used that word. Now everybody uses it and overuses it, and it still doesn't have any meaning. So the question is, how do you know? Well, the systemic model for project management in the development world is not about long-term sustainability. It's about meeting the projection of the 3-year budget plan. I just had this experience with Mercy Corps, which is a great organization, but after a 3-year project in the Spice Islands, I went there because I wanted to try to do organic fair trade spices and stab a dagger in the heart of the birthplace of globalization, the Spice Islands. And they were just closing up their program. They were desperate for someone to buy some spices because they had the program for 3 years and they hadn't sold any spices. So please buy some spices. And I said, I'm not buying into this. So it was sad to see that that dynamic is still alive and well, even with really big, great, well-funded organizations. Well, sometimes social enterprises don't take because they're simply based on bad ideas. Half-baked concept and poor execution. I remember a guy had this great t-shirt idea. He was going to sell you a t-shirt, welcome to Tom's, right? He was going to sell you a t-shirt, and for every t-shirt you bought, he'd give one to a poor kid in Ethiopia. I've worked in Ethiopia for 20 years, and I said, well, okay. First off, where are you getting the t-shirts made? China. Oh, great. So you're getting kids in China to make t-shirts for the kids in Ethiopia. Something's wrong here. You haven't thought this through. Next, I said, how do you know kids in Ethiopia need t-shirts? I work in Ethiopia all the time. The kids have t-shirts. They need schools. Maybe they need shoes, but really they need schools. They need training. So it was a well-intentioned thing, but totally half-baked. P.S. $20 t-shirt to sell, 60-cent, 20-cent t-shirt to give. So, it wasn't really... People use the term social enterprise a little too liberally these days. Anyway, not everybody can be as successful in business as Donald Trump. Not even Donald Trump. Okay. The unintended consequences of social enterprises introducing technologies that interrupt local suppliers, relationships, and safety nets. you know, we're not walking into a clear slate when we go into villages around the world. There are existing safety nets. There are existing cultural, social relationships, political and economic relationships. We have to be incredibly careful when we walk in there. And my first experience with microfinance in Guatemala, that's exactly what happened. Fantastic organization, making village banks around Lake Atitlan. But the banks were shredding the social fabric of the people they were working with. Why? Because they encouraged the women to take a higher loan at each cycle. It's a standard microenterprise approach, which forced the woman to then start spending less time with her family because she had to spend more time on the business and start developing markets beyond the village, which couldn't suck up all her production. So now all of a sudden, you're tearing apart a family. Now all of a sudden, people are having to have different priorities within their family. We have to be very, very conscious of the dynamics of even the best intentioned and smartest from Yale technologies and techniques that we introduce. Very, very dangerous stuff if we don't watch it carefully. New food products and new systems, food systems, can affect land ownership patterns and local market structures. Programs like microloans may be structured inadvertently to shred local community fabric. I got ahead of myself. The bureaucratization of good intentions. Business and NGO structure is hierarchical and has control over people that actually often duplicate the oppression that is found in many of the host villages we work in around the world. So if you walk into a village and you act a certain way and you represent a certain hierarchy, you may be wanting to send this message, but the message that's being received is being received through their cultural and societal lens. And if they're picking up on more hierarchy, what are you doing? You may be creating yet another level of hierarchy on top of already oppressed people, and you don't want to do that. For one thing, people won't buy in. It's just, oh, here's another Jefe. They come, they go. And then when you're gone in 3 years, it's like, there goes the Jefe, next Jefe. And so, you know, we can really not embed ourselves into village life or into the hearts and minds of people with the kind of structures we have, especially if they're overly hierarchical. So we need, if you're going to get buy-in, people have to own and manage the program from the get-go, or at least train up to that very quickly. All of the programs that we have in the 10 countries we work in, and some of them have been going on for 20 years, long past our funding, we haven't funded them for 15 years, is because the local folks own it. They have a vested interest in seeing that thing succeed, because it's not this thing that got plopped on them from the north by really nice people who come and go. And the funding comes and goes. You know, we have to be careful about creating those kind of dependencies, and we have to foster local self-reliance, both psychologically and materially. We also have to be very conscious about the turf wars between development organizations, even well-intended. Happens all the time. Lake Atitlan, Guatemala, there are 5 major international organizations working there. None of them talks to each other. Because of turf, they have to worry. They don't want you to know who my donors are. You know, there's a lot of the internal dynamics of development that can interfere with actual projects working. Okay, the biggest cultural rule that we have to deal with in business is scalability. Everybody talks about it. Our friends at Stanford tell us that if what you are doing is not scalable, then it actually isn't valuable. Well, I think that's completely outrageous. A small-scale project that impacts 100 people, that impacts 2 people, is really significant, because most people in the world don't do anything like that. So in our case, you know, our first well program, we have a revolving loan fund for well building in Ethiopia. That's our first UN award. It keeps going and going and going, because people pay it back, it revolves to the next village, et cetera, et cetera. We brought 3,000 people fresh water for the very first time in history in this area of Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee in Haro Springs. And so I met the Stanford folks on that plane ride back, and they said, well, how are you going to scale it up? And I said, well, I don't really care, because scalability is not the issue here. We're dealing with a local problem. How do we deal with this? Are there lessons to be learned that can be taken elsewhere? Yeah. Do we have to take our thing and make it go like this? No, not necessarily. So they basically dismissed our work, but to the 3,000 people whose kids aren't suffering from diarrhea every day and intestinal parasites, who can actually go to school and focus, you know, for the Muslim half of that community that actually gets to pray because they have clean water, which has great cultural significance to them, it has meaning. They may not go to Stanford, but it has meaning. Okay, I think the Stanford thing confuses self-worth with net worth, and that's a false equation. So part of the scalability issue is the rush to grow, and the rush to grow has been the downfall of many social enterprises. For example, Eziba. Eziba was a great social enterprise started by a friend of mine, and it was about getting women in war-torn areas, conflict areas, to create high-end jewelry, sell it to the market, they get tons of money, yada, yada. It was a great program in the beginning, but they rushed and grew it too fast. They got an order from Fields Markets, Fields, what do you call them, stores, department stores in Chicago for 50,000 units, because that's how those places operate. And they couldn't, when Christmas came, they couldn't deliver. So they got Fields really upset. They canceled all orders. The investors got upset. The whole thing crashed and burned. $5 million social enterprise crashed and burned because they hadn't thought through the growth conundrum. Okay, a personal bugaboo of mine. By the way, so my personal growth philosophy in business is that growth is the outcome of business done well. It is not the goal. Do what you do well and you will grow. Don't set a metric for growth. I think that's a false equation. All right, income generation through export is a very problematic strategy if it's not combined with empowerment on the local level. Women's rights, human rights, cultural survival should not rely on export dollars, although they can play an important role. Many export-driven projects falter when tastes change. Today we're interested in Tibetans. Next year we like the Guatemalan fabric. Happens all the time. Or when investment dollars simply dry up. Without skill building, both technical and management, and self-esteem building on the local level, there's little for these communities to do to fall back on when the project moves on. Creation of local markets may not seem like a cash cow, but it can be more sustainable in the long run. How are we doing on time? Nobody's telling me anything. Great, I'm just going to keep going. What? I'm done? That sucks. All right, I'm going to have to jump past. I'll jump, and that's why I wrote it out, so that it wouldn't go too long. So I'm going to say the last thing. Okay, this is just 1 minute. What are the keys to maximizing your success, your chances of success long term? Okay, design project from the beginning with maximum empowerment on the local level. Create local management control, not passive participation. Strategies of listening. Listen for good ideas, and also to understand cultural, economic, and political currents and eddies in the communities you work with. Design with the acknowledgement of resource shortcomings in the host communities. Bring in trainers, but don't create hierarchies and don't create dependencies. Empower. Look to replace yourself as quickly as possible over time. And remember that the goal of social enterprise is not to sell 1 million widgets or to provide 1 million glasses or to make us feel good and kind. Rather, the goal is to help people understand that they do not have to be passive or victims. Help people achieve self-respect, skills, and opportunity to better their own lives on terms that they wish, and to make those changes not reliant on our perpetual presence. As social entrepreneurs, we are called upon to be activists, advocates, anthropologists, economists, and compassionate friends at the same time. That's what makes social enterprise so challenging. It's also what makes it so fulfilling. Thank you very much.